Very sorry for this late. It's our pleasure also to listen to the Professor Stephen Emmel, the Vice President of the International Society of Coptic Studies, and he is well known in the Monasticism University in Germany. And he is from among of the greatest researchers in the field of the Coptic studies. And he is one of the scientists which the Coptic studies, Coptic Church likes. He is going to speak about the Gnostic library of Nag Hammadi and the excavations of Qibli. I would like to draw your attention that when the Gnostic Gospel of Judas come to Egypt and was put in the Coptic Museum in Cairo, it's caused a lot of dispute in Egyptian newspapers and media. It's well known that all churches all over the world deny this gospel and all other the Gnostic gospel. We are now ready to listen to the lecture of Professor Stephen Emmel, and I invite him to start your lecture.
So thank you very much for coming. Nice to see so many friends and colleagues again. Fao el-Qibli, South Fao, is identifiable with the ancient village called Pebou, both on the basis of the name, Pebou is phonetically similar to Fao, and by the presence at the western edge of town of architectural remains that are best interpreted as parts of an ancient church. This church has been designated the Basilica of St. Pachomius ever since it was first described in Western scholarship by Evitz and Butler near the end of the 19th century, then by Michel Julien and Louis Massignon about 100 years ago, and somewhat later by Louis Théophile Lefort. We know from ancient literary sources concerning Pachomius and his successors that Pebou was the second and most important monastery in the Pachomian institution. It was founded by him around 336-337 as the institution's administrative center when the original center at Tabanese, a bit farther upriver from Fao, began to seem too small. Pachomius died 10 years after the foundation at Pebou in the year 347. And thereafter, for centuries, the superior of the whole Pachomian congregation resided at Pebou. The site of the Basilica of St. Pachomius was recognizable mainly from the presence of a number of granite columns lying exposed on the surface. It was presumably for that reason that the site became protected by the Egyptian Antiquities Organization, so that the village of Fao was held more or less at bay both to the south and to the east of the exposed remains. These photographs were taken in 1974 before any extensive excavation had been undertaken, and what you're seeing here is the edge of the village and the beginning of the antiquities site on which it was not allowed to build. This is looking more in the direction of the east. The house is extended a little bit farther this way, and the area of the presumed location of the basilica was used only as a place for feeding animals. To the north and to the west of the protected area lay cultivated fields. Now, probably we will never know much about the physical layout of the monastery complex of which the church was but a part. Some scant remains of buildings other than the church have been exposed here and there, but such buildings were most likely nowhere near as sturdily constructed as the church itself to begin with, and have in any case fallen more or less victim to agriculture. Or else, perhaps they lie beneath the current structures of Fao Qibli. Now, the orientation of this site is a little bit confusing, for even though it is on the east bank of the Nile, when one stands in the church and looks west with the church's apse at your back, then one faces and sees in the distance the cliffs of the eastern high desert. This disorientation is explained by the fact that here the river has made not only a large bend westward, that's something you see very clearly in any map of Egypt, but also at this particular area, there has been a slighter bend southward. You can see on this more local map, this is Fal Qibli with the Basilica of St. Pachomius. It's made a slighter bend towards the south so that there is almost a complete reversal in the normal relationship between the direction of the river's flow and the points of the compass. Even though one is on the east bank still of the river as a whole, here one is west of the river, and the cliffs at the edge of the eastern river valley are off to the west. That way, instead of, as usual, off to the east. This situation might also explain why tombs of 6th dynasty nobles from the Pharaonic period are found in this area on the eastern bank, and specifically cut into this face of the cliff, the Gebel Tarif, about which I'll say more later, which are in effect facing to the east, even though they're on the eastern bank of the river. Now, excavations undertaken at the Fal Qibli site in 1976, 1977, 1979, 1986, and 1989 focused mainly on clarifying the architectural remains of the church, or rather, as turned out to be the case, of the churches. Now let me just make a couple of comments about the relationship between this plan, which shows the site of the Basilica of St. Pachomius prior to excavation, and the photos you saw earlier. These are the outlines of buildings of Fal Qibli. And this is the protected area. The cultivated land is all around here. The last photo that I showed you was taken more or less looking at this direction. And as it turned out, the apse of the basilica lay entirely underneath modern buildings. It could only be presumed on the basis of some very faint traces that could be seen here and other considerations. So when I spoke about standing and facing west with the apse behind you and nonetheless seeing the eastern cliffs, I meant looking this direction. Parts of these column bases were already visible, which made it possible to identify the site as possibly a basilica, but excavations revealed that in fact there were remains of 3 buildings superimposed one upon the other, which results, of course, in a rather complicated archaeological situation. And Peter Grossmann, who was the main architectural member of the excavations, together with Gary Lees, who took over the direction of the excavations in the latter part after Bastian van Elderen, Grossmann and Lees were able to distinguish 3 different church buildings superimposed one upon the other. Here you see most clearly the apses of 3 different churches. This drawing here is oriented in such a way so that you can simply compare here the progressive exposure of material remains. I'm sorry. This now is oriented in a somewhat more normal fashion for looking at the plan of a church. This, of course, for anyone who has looked into this site at all, is a very famous drawing. It's been published many times, and it's rather difficult to interpret because of the superimposition of 3 different churches. And happily, Grossmann, in his most recent publication on the subject, his big book on Christliche Architektur in Ägypten, 2002, separated out these 3 plans in a much more convenient way for studying them. So this is now the plan of the largest church. This is the middle-sized one, which is in fact physically superimposed upon it, and this one superimposed upon the two in the previous drawings. Now, the oldest of the three buildings is also the smallest, here shown on the left, and the simplest. According to Grossman's analysis, it did not initially include an apse, which is something, of course, that we tend to think of as the most essential feature of any church. This is a later addition to an originally even simpler rectangular structure. Rather, but the absence of this feature does not necessarily mean that this building was not built to be a church, as one might think. Rather, it might suggest that the building began as a general purpose assembly hall, among whose functions liturgical worship was only one. Grossman has preferred to emphasize Pachomius's humility, designing a rather simple and modest church to begin with. When and why an apse was later added to this building, in any case, is something that we can only estimate and guess about. We have no direct access to any sources to explain it. But in any case, it must have been added before the original structure was replaced by a somewhat larger version of more or less the same building. That is, in both cases, a five-aisled church. And this time, in the second phase, remember, this building was constructed effectively, you can see from the side, it fits very neatly over the center part of the second church to be constructed. A five-aisled church, this time equipped with an apse from the very start and built right atop the foundations of the first church. Grossman has argued for a certain probability that the second enlarged church should be attributed to the patronage of the Archbishop Theophilus, who had his period in office from 385 till 412, hence near the end of the 4th century. A consideration that perhaps recommends such a dating is that it places approximately equal intervals of time between the three superimposed church buildings. Thus, about 60 years would have passed before the first church was replaced by the second, and then another 60 years before the erection of the great Basilica of St. Pachomius, the much larger structure, which was the last structure on the site. This third and last church can be dated with reasonable confidence to the middle of the 5th century, because there is literary evidence, namely the text of a sermon delivered by Timothy II Ilurus on the occasion of the basilica's consecration on the 7th of November, 459. Grossman has characterized the church as a spectacular example of a great hall church supporting a large community of monks. Now, how long this basilica remained in use and intact is a matter of speculation, for we know too little about the history of Pabot, as of the Pachomian movement in general, after the period of Abraham of Farshut during the reign of Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. We'll hear more about Abraham after my lecture from James Goering. Abu Saleh, writing in the 13th century, records that the basilica was destroyed by al-Hakim around the year 1000. Perhaps, as Grossman has suggested, al-Hakim plundered a building that was already in a ruined state. But in any case, al-Hakim's reign, that is from 996 till 1021, may be taken as the terminus a quo for the completely ruinous state of the basilica. In time, all the building stone was robbed for other purposes, leaving only the foundations and some of the pavements, a few column capitals that were found buried, and, of course, a number of columns scattered on the surface. After a single season of digging in 1968 by Ferdinand de Bono, what motivated renewed archaeological work at Pabot was the American Research Center in Egypt's Nag Hammadi Codices editing project, directed by James M. Robinson from 1974 through 1977. of which I was a member. I mention that because I'm going to show up in some of these photographs, it's inevitable, and which also resulted in the founding of the International Association for Coptic Studies in 1976 at the first International Congress of Coptology at the end of that year. I think a number of us here, not just me, were in attendance at that meeting, as a matter of fact. Now, the Nag Hammadi Codices editing project had as its main goal the final reconstruction and conservation of the Nag Hammadi Codices, an extraordinary collection of 13 papyrus books dating from the 5th century or perhaps from the later 4th century, and containing mostly primary Gnostic texts translated from Greek into Coptic, literature that for the most part survives in no other form. These are mostly absolutely unique documents now stored in the Coptic Museum in Old Cairo. The success of the Research Center's Nag Hammadi Codices editing project meant, first of all, the completion of a complete photographic facsimile edition of the manuscripts, published between 1972 and 1977, with an introductory volume a number of years later. And that work had been supervised by a UNESCO committee, a technical subcommittee of the International Committee for the Nag Hammadi Codices, which began its work in 1970. And this is a photograph of that technical subcommittee doing its work at a meeting in 1973. In a way, Jim Robinson's Nag Hammadi Codices editing project was a way of assisting the work of this group with a job that was far too large to be carried out in 2-week sessions a couple of times a year. It also meant the possibility of completing the complete English language critical edition and translation of the Nag Hammadi Codices, generally edited by James Robinson, and to give opportunities for scholars working on editions and translations into other languages, particularly German and French, to start their projects. This photograph shows among the workers here Hans Martin Schenke, then of East Germany, in eastern Berlin, who of course is the leader of the famous Berliner Arbeitskreis für die koptisch-gnostische Schriften, which has just recently published its complete German translation. Not shown in this photograph, but in attendance at various times in the 1970s was Jacques Ménard, who began the French language series of editions and translations coming now out of Laval, which is nearing its completion. So this was an extremely fruitful time for work on the Nag Hammadi manuscripts at every single level, placing fragments, reconstructing leaves, conserving, photographing, transcribing, translating, and of course, working to interpret the contents. That's me, by the way. This is Hans Martin Schenke, Charlie Hedrick, Anita Robinson, Charlie Hedrick, James Robinson, and Charlie Hedrick, working on various aspects of the project. This were all 1975. Now, in the fall of 1974, travel to parts of Upper Egypt other than the main tourist sites like Luxor became possible again for the first time since the 1967 war with Israel. I don't know how many of you remember, but there was a long period of time when tourists, foreigners, were not allowed to travel in Egypt except in Cairo, Alexandria, and Luxor, for example. And first in the fall of 1974 did this become possible, and Jim Robinson immediately took the opportunity to arrange for members of the Nag Hammadi Codices editing project to visit the Gebel Tarif, the most exciting tourist site in Egypt for some of us. And of course, other sites in the vicinity of Nag Hammadi, which is very rich in sites related to early Christianity. And we began at that time to plan relatively modest archaeological investigations at the Gebel, mainly in an attempt to try to confirm that the Nag Hammadi Codices were in fact discovered there in 1945, as had been claimed. Up until then, there was only hearsay evidence. In the very beginning of 1975, we began to prepare for these archaeological excavations by making a map, among other things. And this was especially the task of Bentley Layton, who is shown in this photograph, and myself. We had no surveying equipment except for a compass and a paper and pencil and a pole, but Bentley was very clever, and using the compass and a series of cairns of stone that we carefully laid out and some carefully trained assistants, in fact, we had a whole crew of assistants, we were able to, in fact, produce what is now a very rare document, was never published, but this map of the Qibli Tarif, to my knowledge, the first detailed scientific map of the area where the Nag Hammadi codices were said to have been found. Because we had no idea at that time how long it might be possible for us to return, we tried to do things in a way that would be easily recognizable in the future. We named, for example, outstanding rocks that were very noticeable, such as my favorite monkey's face and finger rock and so forth. Cat's head. If you go to Nag Hammadi and the Qibli Tarif, I think you won't have any difficulty using our map if you can find a copy of it. This was useful for making initial plans, especially noting the areas where there were caves and tombs cut into the rock face, which were possible candidates for the actual discovery site of the Nag Hammadi codices. But one of the things that we did in the first season, actually the winter of 1975, was to get professionally trained archaeologists in with professional equipment and to make a real map. So the Bentley's and my map never really had much of a history of use. Hans-Åke Nordström from Sweden here was our surveyor who came with a theodolite and taught meine Wenigkeit how to use such a thing. And he also taught me how to use a slide rule, and we produced a much more scientific map on this basis. Nowadays, as some of you probably know, there's a thing called a total station that you connect to your computer, and it does most of that for you. This was really a great deal of fun. I'm not sure I would enjoy surveying any other way myself. I was able to use my high school trigonometry, finally, to good purpose. This is the map that was produced. It's been published once in the journal Biblical Archaeologist from the middle of the 1970s and will probably be republished. The main purpose here was to give identifying numbers to all of the very many tombs and caves, to mark where a magnetometer resistivity survey was undertaken in the low area of the, this is, of course, the cliff of the high desert, the cultivated area. In between the low desert, very limited surveys were undertaken just to see if there were any traces of structures beneath the sand or any signs of burials. It had once been claimed that this area was a cemetery apart from being an area of pharaonic tombs. And during that winter of 1975, while Hans-Åke and I were producing the map, others were supervising digging and sifting of sand. This is showing the excavation of the areas where the magnetometer resistivity survey suggested there might be something to find. There was nothing to find except potsherds and dirt, of course. We also focused on one of the caves which showed clear signs of use by Coptic-speaking people in late antiquity. These are the workers sifting dirt that was being brought out of a cave, the entrance of which you can see here. Cave number 8, as a matter of fact. What made it clear that this cave had been reused in Coptic times was the careful writing on the walls, now mostly fallen away. You have to imagine at one time the walls were completely covered with Coptic script here. Psalm in Kippets, the opening lines of a set of psalms from the Old Testament, probably used for purposes of prayer and meditation by some monastic-like people retreating to the cave. Here, too, we found lots of remains of habitation, potsherds, bones, some coins. But, of course, what we were really looking for was one single scrap of papyrus that might have been attached to a piece of one of the Nag Hammadi codices, which would prove that they had once been in that area. And that kind of confirmatory evidence was absolutely lacking. which means that in terms of identifying the Gebel Tarif as the origin, the site of the discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices, we still rely entirely on the reports of the man who claims to have been their discoverer and people that were associated with him at the time. I'm not going to rehearse the whole story of that, just to mention that the most concrete evidence that he was able to produce of that discovery is this Roman period bowl, which he said had been used as a lid on top of a ceramic jar, which he sketched very roughly as having looked like that, in which the Nag Hammadi codices had been concealed and which he broke, and thereby making the discovery. Now, there are other possibilities for dating and locating not necessarily the site of the discovery, but the provenance, in a sense, of such manuscripts. Apart from their contents, potentially their language and so forth, the best evidence is what is known as cartonnage, scrap papyrus that was used to create a kind of papier-mâché layering, to create a kind of cardboard lining the inside of the leather covers into which the manuscripts were bound. So this shows a cover closed with its flap and thong, the same cover open with some layers of scrap papyrus still in place. This was covered by a nice clean sheet of papyrus at the time the book was bound, but by removing the pieces of scrap papyrus, this by the way is just a color photograph of the same, it's very often that one finds this scrap papyrus was reused and had once been inscribed, and to the extent that such inscribed papyrus might bear place names and dates, it provides clues, perhaps, to the location of the manufacture of the book, and perhaps also to the date. Any date that's found, one can conclude the book could not have been manufactured earlier, with reasonable logic. In terms of place names, for example, I'll just show you one example of such cartonnage removed from Nag Hammadi Codex 1 and published as P. Nag Hammadi 1. This is a Greek manuscript. There were both Greek and Coptic fragments in the covers. And here we have abbreviated the place name Kenoboskion, which is in fact a well-known site not too far from the Gebel Tarif. Diospolis is also mentioned. This would be Diospolis Parwa, now Hugh, which is just a little south of Nag Hammadi, and so on. Quite a number of place names are identifiable in the cartonnage and indicate that the covers, at least, were associated somehow with Upper Egypt, between Hermopolis and Cana, let's say, approximately. Unfortunately, the initial reports on the contents of the cartonnage led to a certain hypothesis about their provenance that took on a kind of life of its own. I'm going to call it the Pachomian hypothesis. This word, for example, even if you're not very practiced with reading ancient Greek script, might look to you like mu, omicron, nu, eta, sigma, mones, and that could well be a word for monasterium, monastery. And an initial report on this material suggested that the cartonnage as a whole, many, many pieces, could have come from a monastic archive, and the suggestion was made that they were the products of a Pachomian monastery, such as, for example, the monastery at Pabo or at Tabanesi. Later on, the same man who made that reading admitted he'd read it wrong. This is not a mu, it's a kappa. That's komes, the word for village. And in fact, there's no evidence in this text whatsoever for a monastic origin. However, in other texts, it did seem that there was confirmatory evidence. This is a Coptic letter. And here we have the address to my beloved father, Pachom, from Pathnute. These are names that are very famous, of course, from the classical period of the Pachomian monastic movement, and seem to suggest a monastic milieu. Of course, they were also very common names outside of the monastic movement, and in the end, they are not decisive evidence for determining provenance. In fact, on the whole, the cartonnage suggests a rather normal mixture of documents, probably from a quite public trash dump. There's certainly no reason to say that there's any special indication there that this material must have come from the wastebaskets of a Pachomian monastery. However, this Pachomian connection, which led to quite a number of interesting investigations and long discussions, raises the obviously important question in any case of where did these manuscripts come from? How did they come into exist? Who made them? Who wanted them? And that's a topic I want to turn to now. I take the liberty of referring back to a lecture that I gave at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature in 1995, which was in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the discovery of the Nag Hammadi codices. In that paper, which I called Religious Tradition, Textual Transmission, and the Nag Hammadi Codices, I made use of Frederick Wyss's summary of what we call the transmission history, the history of recopying, of transmitting down through generations, in this case specifically of the Apocryphon of John, which is one of the works copied in Nag Hammadi Codex II. This is probably the most often reproduced page of a Nag Hammadi Codex because it also has the beginning of the Gospel of Thomas. But this is the end of the Apocryphon of John, the According to John Apocryphon. At that time, 1995, Wysse, together with Michael Waldstein, had just finished their synoptic edition of the Apocryphon of John for the Coptic Gnostic Library series of editions of the Nag Hammadi Codices, Jim Robinson's project. And Wysse was concerned to explain the severe difficulties that he and his colleague had faced in trying to prepare even a critical translation of the work, not to speak of a critical edition. Trying to produce any kind of a critical text of this classic work of Gnostic scripture is difficult because we have not just one, but 4 witnesses to the Coptic text, which in this case makes the task of preparing a critical edition of the traditional sort, in fact, impossible. But even apart from that, because, as Wysse wrote, it is in the very nature of such a text, that is, a work of apocryphal, esoteric, philosophical mythology, it's in the very nature of such a text that it will include no unambiguous clues about its real author, the date, and the circumstances of its composition. Any scholarly attempt to speak of these issues must not only be very modest in its claims, he wrote, but must also be careful to observe the rule that the more simple explanation is the better one. Wysse has always been one of our most consistent positivistic skeptics, and so it's no surprise that he privileged the history of the Apocryphon of John's textual transmission as providing the best clues. That is, better than any information we may think we can glean from the text itself. The starting point of the textual transmission is the onset of what Wysse called the composition phase, which must be understood to include not only the composition of the work, and hence some kind of an ur-text, which in the case of the works in the Nag Hammadi codices is usually assumed to have been written in Greek, but also the transmission and redaction of the Greek text down to the particular exemplars from which the Coptic translation was made. The next phase in the history of transmission was critical for the survival of the works in the Nag Hammadi codices up to modern times. But at the same time, it is what has rendered our access to the earlier phases almost impenetrably obscure. This is the translation phase, beginning with someone in Egypt translating the individual texts from Greek into Coptic, followed by a history of recopying the Coptic texts. It seems clear that this phase, which we assume began no earlier than the mid to late 3rd century, which is when, to the best of our knowledge, Coptic literature had its beginnings, this phase was quite complex, for it involved not only mere recopying of text, but with the usual sort of scribal corruption, but also purposeful alteration in linguistically, that is dialectally, diverse circumstances. I now assume, following Wolf-Peter Funk's lead, that the works in the Nag Hammadi codices, and I quote, were originally translated in various parts of Egypt into different regional dialects, each translation thus being, so to speak, dialectally pure to begin with. Many of these non-Sahidic texts were then later translated, or sometimes just superficially transcribed, into a kind of approximative Sahidic, a process of retranslation within the Coptic phase of transmission itself, end quote. Even though we believe we have empirical evidence for this process of retranslation within Coptic, we have no way of being sure about the length of time involved, nor about the degree of alteration that a text might have undergone in that process, which might have been tantamount to redaction, that is, a kind of rewriting. What completes the impenetrability for us of the earlier phases of transmission, we might as well say of the Greek phases, is of course the fact that in most cases we have no direct access to any Greek texts of the works in the Nag Hammadi codices. Only in a few small fragments do we have something like the Greek exemplars of the translations. Now, Wissi called his fourth and final phase, I know it's only the third I've mentioned, but there was an earlier phase, his fourth and final phase in the history of transmission, the Coptic monastic phase, a designation with which I myself took mild issue in my lecture a decade ago, because I, like many others, was not even at that time convinced that the Nag Hammadi codices, as particular books, as artifacts, are the direct products of a monastic milieu. The strong indications, and I'm quoting, that the Nag Hammadi codices were produced and used by monks in a Pacomian monastery located near the discovery site were at just that time, around 1995, being shown to be much less strong than some had continued to think them to be. In my opinion, Alexander Khosroyev effectively demolished the edifice of the Pacomian monastic hypothesis in his book of 1995, Die Bibliothek von Nag Hammadi. More recent efforts, especially by James Goering, to revive the Pacomian monastic hypothesis in a modified and more careful form, to my mind, only go to show that it cannot be entirely excluded as a possibility without necessarily making it any more historically probable. Khosroyev's alternative to the monastic hypothesis, to which I will also return a little bit later, points rather in the direction of city culture. Rather than Wissi's, and I quote, unilingual Copts who were joining the increasingly popular anchoritic monastic movement, hermits who would have brought esoteric books like the Apocryphon of John into the Cenobitic communities which some of them joined during the first half of the 4th century. Instead of that picture, I think we should imagine bilingual, Hellenized Egyptians who grew up and remained in the largely Greek-speaking metropoles of the Nile Valley, where they were in communication with like-minded members of the same class or group who shared an interest in this sort of esoteric and in some sense also erudite literature. Now, if the final phase of transmission is not to be labeled Coptic monastic, then how should it be called? Perhaps we should simply call it the Nag Hammadi codices phase. For this phase includes, and I quote, the entire history of each codex from the time of its manufacture to the time of its burial, meaning whatever circumstance caused these particular books to be buried together in a sealed jar and their condition at that time. Of course, insofar as we must have in view here not only the Nag Hammadi codices, but also similar Coptic Gnostic manuscripts like the Berlin Gnostic Codex, the Bruce and Askew codices in England, and the newly discovered papyrus codex containing the Gospel of Judas, and other works similar, or sometimes even known from the Nag Hammadi codices, and a few others, the label Nag Hammadi codices phase must be taken as being no more than emblematic for the particular surviving Coptic manuscripts that happen to make the history of transmission under investigation accessible at all. These archaeological artifacts, the handful of Coptic Gnostic books that we happen to have, in which we have, that's what we have mainly to work with. Of course, it's reasonable to assume that they are only a small sample of a much larger number of such manuscripts that once existed, but they are the only ones we have, and perhaps they are only ones we will ever have, unless fortune favors us with further accidental discoveries of accidentally surviving manuscripts, as it has again. Just a week ago, I saw the new issue of Le Muséon with an article by Rudolf Casser and Philippe Louisier publishing Papyrus Bodmer 43, which is a leaf from a papyrus codex with another copy of Zostrianos, a work that is preserved in Nag Hammadi Codex 8. It's a very similar script. I'm sorry the photo is so bad. It's simply a copy of Casser's plate. But it's now our 19th substantial witness to Coptic Gnostic literature. And one can only hope that such discoveries, he says nothing about the provenance, by the way, acquired in 1970 or so. In the scholarship that has been dedicated to the Nag Hammadi codices in general, much attention has been paid from the beginning to the question of who owned this unusual collection of books and why its owner or owners buried them in a ceramic jar at the desert's edge and never returned for them. If they had, we would probably never have them ourselves. Most probably, we will never know for certain what the answers are to these questions, and I've already indicated my own conviction that we should not necessarily look to the early Christian monastic movement for answers. In thinking about the Nag Hammadi codices as a group, we must always bear in mind that they do not necessarily constitute a library in the sense of this word that our modern culture has made primary. Indeed, there are good reasons to believe that the group of books that we have was originally divided into smaller groups that are perhaps more likely to have had something like the status of libraries previous to their having been brought together for secretive burial. For example, Nag Hammadi Codex 2, which includes the Apocryphon of John among its contents, belongs to a distinct group together with Codex 13 and perhaps also one or all of Codices 6, 9, and 10. The most obviously distinct group comprises Codices 1, 7, and 11, which are linked to each other by identical scribal hands and other traits as well. Just briefly to show you what I'm talking about, this is a page from Nag Hammadi Codex 1. You see it's written by two different scribes. The handwritings are quite distinct. This is the end of one work, a line of decoration, and then the treatise on resurrection in pure Lycopolitan. In Nag Hammadi Codex 11, the first two works are written in an identical hand, so identical when you compare them in detail that there's really no reason not to assume that the same scribe who worked here also worked in Codex 11. The third and fourth works in Codex 11, however, are written again by a different scribe with a very distinct hand, but his hand turns up also in Nag Hammadi Codex 7. The entirety of Codex 7, of which this is just one page, is clearly written by the same scribe as wrote the last two works in Codex 11. So these three codices are related in time and space by the scribes who worked on them in some way. One should also remember that Codex 7 is the only Nag Hammadi codex for which we think we can offer something like a precise date, because the inscribed Greek papyri from its leather binding, part of its cartonnage, include a few dates. This is the most firmly dated document. Once again, it's written in very cursive Greek, but it begins with a very clear dating formula. In the consulship of, and we have then Constantius and Constans, precisely which consulship. We even have a month of Hathor, and the day, the 25th of Hathor. This can be dated precisely to the date in November in 346. There's another document that seems clearly enough dated to 348. So just before the middle of the 4th century, very firm evidence that this cover of Nag Hammadi Codex 7 could not have been manufactured until sometime after these dates. But how much time after? A year? 2 years? 10 years? 50 years? 100 years? We have no way of knowing. Nonetheless, the general assumption, often an unexamined one I fear, seems to have become that the Nag Hammadi codices were all manufactured in roughly this area of Upper Egypt, or a little bit to the north, during the second half of the 4th century, with a strong tendency to mention the middle of that century specifically, which I think is not likely given that the dated material that we have is from the very middle of the century. On the basis of this assumption of the mid to late 4th century date of the Nag Hammadi codices, as it's often put, the composition phase, that is the phase of composition in Greek, could have been, as Wissey rightly emphasized, as late as the early 4th century. For none of the Nag Hammadi tractates, he argued, are there compelling reasons to date them in their original Greek form before the 3rd century, although it is certainly possible that some were composed earlier. That's, of course, in some details a debatable point, but the general point is clear. The Greek text could have been written any time up to just the day before the Coptic translation. But if the codices as artifacts are possibly to be dated as late as the 5th century, or even later, I hate to think of how uncertain we are about Coptic paleography. We like to think we know something, but if you really press it, what do we really know? If they could be dated so late, then it is theoretically possible that some of the Greek texts represented in these manuscripts were composed even that late. We're on very uncertain ground here. For trying to determine when the Coptic translation was made, there are two relevant considerations. First, regardless of our dating of the manuscripts as such, we must allow for there to have been a history of transmission in Coptic before the manufacture of the Nag Hammadi codices. It's clear from the details of the Coptic text that they had been recopied already a number of times. But here, too, we stand before an imponderable. How many copies and how long a period of time? I myself would rather not hazard a guess, because I can as well imagine a relatively short period of time, during which perhaps the texts were recopied many times in rapid succession, even retranslated or redacted in the course of being recopied. I can imagine that as easily as I can imagine a relatively long period of time with the same result in the end. The second consideration that is relevant here has to do with how early any of the Nag Hammadi tractates might have been translated into Coptic. I'm sorry to say that here again we are on, unfortunately, uncertain ground. We may take a statement by Wolf-Peter Funk on this topic as well-informed and appropriately cautious. He has written, "The original translation from Greek into Coptic in any given case may date as far back as the second half of the 3rd century, or it may have taken place during the years around 350, shortly before the production of the copy known to us." Now, Funk's terminus post quem, the second half of the 3rd century, is simply the period from which we presently believe that our oldest, more or less standardized Coptic manuscripts come. So, could be as early as the beginnings of Coptic literature, whenever that exactly was. But mid-3rd century seems a reasonable hypothesis as the earliest period. Well, his terminus ad quem, the latest possible date, the years around 350, as he put it, is simply the date of the cartonnage in Nag Hammadi Codex 7. On the other hand, despite these many uncertainties, Funk rightly concluded his inspiring study of the linguistic aspect of classifying the Nag Hammadi codices a decade ago by focusing on what he called the Coptic Gnostic material's traveler aspect, which he described as follows. Quite evidently, at least a few of our texts in some Coptic version and format did a great deal of traveling along the Nile Valley before they arrived in the Nag Hammadi region. During these travels, they were doubtless part of the luggage of certain persons who may or may not have been interested in their specific contents. They may have changed carriers from time to time, and they were probably taken out of the bag at a number of places to be read, modified, copied, thus, in a sense, published, so as to multiply into several chains of transmission. That is to say, at such stopovers on the way, possibly involving a more extended stay in some places, like Lycopolis, for example, they can be assumed to have undergone the same kind of treatment that they were evidently given on their arrival in southern Egypt. As a consequence of the personal or professional contacts between their carriers and other persons indigenous to the region, they were gradually adapted to their new environment. This adaptation, it seems, was hardly ever accomplished 100%. That's how we can detect it. If they were pure Sahidic, in every case, we would have no evidence for any kind of transmission. But dialectal mixture indicates that someone was trying to improve them and was not always very successful. At some stages during the process, there happened to be editors who thought it fit to unite one or two pieces of the imported goods with their other interesting material that derived more directly from their home production. Such miscellaneous volumes may have had quite a history of their own before some of the items happened to be chosen for inclusion in the codices we are proud to have. Whatever the particular interest, I'm still quoting from Funk, these people took in these writings may have been, and they seem to have resembled modern scholarship in focusing on the ideas rather than the form in which these were expressed, and however strong their desire to produce fine books of calligraphy, it is hard to overlook a certain negligence on their part with regard to language detail. This suggests, I think, that the production, again, still Funk, that the production and distribution effort was rather a private one, compared with the codices of mainly biblical texts, which even in their linguistic usage reveal a higher degree of publicity and neutrality. The Nag Hammadi codices appear to be strongly customized books. In other words, the case of Codex 6, which is pictured here, where such a customization is beyond doubt thanks to the scribal note, which is in the middle, may well be taken as typical of the entire collection, even though the particular persons involved, both producers and owners, may differ from case to case. Now, it's useful to be reminded about this extraordinary scribal note in Nag Hammadi Codex 6. It's a text of 7 lines, written in the same practiced literary hand as the rest of the codex, enclosed in a carefully drawn box near the top of page 65. That is between the end of Tractate 7 in the Codex, which is the Hermetic prayer of thanksgiving, and the beginning of the final tractate in the Codex known as Asclepius, which is also a work from the Hermetic tradition. Despite a number of difficulties in the precise interpretation of this note, its basic import seems to be clear. A group of individuals, at least 2 people anyway, had commissioned someone as an agent, the author of the note, to prepare a collection of works in a single volume, Nag Hammadi Codex 6, giving the agent at least some authority to choose just what works to procure by means of copying. Confronted with a large number of works by a single author, whom we call Hermes Trismegistos, whose corpus thus seems to have been relatively easy to acquire, the agent felt constrained to express to his patrons his concern not to procure for them any works that they might already have in their possession. Now, initially, Michael Williams found Nag Hammadi Codex 6 to be, I quote, on the surface the most diverse assemblage of tractates among the Nag Hammadi volumes, thus potentially frustrating his interesting attempt to find rationales underlying the composition, that is, the order of the tractates in the individual books in the Nag Hammadi codices. Why is each codex organized the way it is? Why does it contain the collection of works that it contains? He made a case, nonetheless, for there being such a rationale here too. And on the basis of his set of cases concerning all the Nag Hammadi codices except 10, 12, and 13, he argued that rather than coming to us as a jumbled hodgepodge of traditions, the tractates come to us ordered. If we stand any chance at all of understanding the motivations for the collections in the Nag Hammadi library, as he called it, we will have to take these arrangements into account, for they offer us the most direct clues about how the writings in these volumes were understood by their 4th century owners, reading them in Coptic, of course. And who, according to Williams, were those 4th century owners? I quote, everything points to 4th century Egyptian Christian monks. Everything, he said. The best description of whom, and now I quote, would be that they seem to have been, 1, persons who accepted the biblical demiurgical proposition that the cosmos was not created as a result of the initiative of the higher God, so a basic Gnostic proposition. 2, who were intensely interested in speculation about the true nature of divinity and the supracosmic realm, so a kind of mystical knowledge. 3, who were focused on the soul's eventual transcendence of the created order and on patterns of spirituality that would contribute to this goal, salvation being rescue from this cosmos and taken to some place beyond it, and 4 who saw nothing unchristian in these views, taking them to be Christian books. End of quote. Furthermore, the Nag Hammadi codices owners, actually, no, I'm continuing the quote. The owners viewed these tractates as being much less heterogeneous than do modern scholars, and might even have perceived complete theological consistency within the volumes. Continuing to quote from Michael Williams, a 4th century context, one way to think of the texts that were still being gathered together in collections like the Nag Hammadi books is as debris from religious experiments that never really created successful new religions. Nevertheless, the shards were still being reused, assembled in new combinations and designs, the debris being scavenged for precious, enduring truths. I myself find all of Williams' ideas quite congenial, except for his labeling the owners of the manuscripts in question as Egyptian Christian monks. To me, his characterization of these people's mentality and of their religio-cultural milieu seems somehow to point more clearly, as does Funk's traveler aspect of the manuscript's contents, into a metropolitan, a city context. Of course, Egyptian Christian monks might perhaps have been found in any of the metropolises along the Nile, but I think that the cities will have offered more likely candidates to be considered. The problem is that these candidates are difficult to identify and to name. And now I am ready to pose the question that mainly concerns me in all of this, which is, why in Coptic? Why should these persons have wanted this literature in Coptic rather than in Greek? Now, it's always possible that in the 4th or 3rd or 5th centuries, there were Greek Gnostic codices, parallel in content to the Coptic Gnostic codices. But whereas the latter happen to have survived, their Greek counterparts have, apart from a few small fragments, simply disappeared. But as a Coptologist, I'm compelled to pose this question, why in Coptic, not only with regard to the Coptic Gnostic literature, but with regard to many other pieces of Coptic literature as well. Why is there a Coptic literature? As an appendix to a recent edition and translation of 2 pages of a work of Pachomius' successor, Horsiasa, Enzo Lucchesi has posed the question, for whom were the Coptic translations made, and for what purpose? Now, what impelled Lucchesi to offer his reflections on this question was the particular difficulty that he had in translating his Horsiasa fragment, which, as he observed, in order to be understood, by us at least, must be rethought in Greek. That's a feeling that one often has, trying to translate some parts of Coptic literature, especially some of the parts of the Nag Hammadi corpus. Lucchesi's reflections begin with a brief rehearsal of what he regards as the general opinion, namely that translations into Coptic were meant mainly for uncultivated people, uneducated people, especially the masses of illiterate monks. In the face of this common opinion, Lucchesi effectively exposes its improbability, or even absurdity, in the case of a Coptic text such as the one that he had such difficulty translating, arguing instead that it could not easily have been understood by anyone at all, especially not by uneducated people. And if the common view of the purpose of Coptic translation literature does not hold up in the case of works of edification, such as the Horsiasi piece, then it must be judged all the more unsatisfactory in the case of texts of a philosophical nature, or of pure theological speculation, like the Gnostic texts, many of them. As an alternative, he suggests that it would be more logical and reasonable to think that parts of Coptic literature translated from Greek with a remarkable degree of literalness, which is partly what makes them difficult to understand, perhaps, such texts might be the results of certain Coptophones' attempts to learn Greek, or to improve their knowledge of Greek. This provocative idea is of value, even if those translations, once having been brought into existence, for better or for worse, for some immediate and perhaps more or less private purpose, even if they went on to serve quite different purposes by being recopied and transmitted over succeeding centuries. Interestingly, Lucchesi mentions the Nag Hammadi texts as being a special case in that they are writings whose esotericism, purposely cultivated, was already inherent in the underlying Greek text. He also sets the Bible and strictly liturgical texts apart as being obviously intended, we might even say prescribed, in large part for use in worship services. Manichaean literature surely belongs to this group as well. Let us think for a moment about the initial translation of the Nag Hammadi texts from Greek into Coptic, for I must emphasize that the question why in Coptic has two aspects to it. First, why was anyone motivated to translate this literature into Coptic in the first place? And second, once it was available in Coptic, why was anyone motivated to read it in that language, and hence also to procure copies of it, thus creating a market and motive for its transmission, and for more translations, perhaps. I should also indicate that I'm not at all insensitive to the possibility, or even the likelihood, that somewhat differing motivations were at work in various cases. But if we were to try to describe the problem in all its complexity, we wouldn't get anywhere. Thinking primarily about such texts as, for example, the Gospel of Truth, the Tripartite Tractate, the three Steles of Seth, Zostrianos, Allogenes, it is nearly impossible for me to imagine that the market for Coptic translations of such works was non-Greek-speaking Coptophones, nor even Coptophones who were trying to learn Greek. As Lucchesi pointed out in connection even just with the relatively simple work of Horsiesi on friendship, if one imagines that such works were translated or transposed into Coptic for the sake of an audience with no Greek, one must face the paradox that, and I quote, "In order to understand them, one practically needs a profound knowledge of Greek, or at least a certain familiarity with the structure of Greek sentences, or put otherwise, habits of mind that only bilingual people could have had." Since some of us sometimes pose the question, at least to ourselves, whether the people who translated the works in the Nag Hammadi codices had better knowledge of Greek or of Coptic, we might be tempted to toy with the idea of the translation being the results of certain Hellenophones, Greek speakers' attempts to learn Coptic or to improve their knowledge of it. But why should they have wanted to do that except to be able to produce better Coptic translations? And if that was their motivation, then we are right back to the question of why anyone was motivated to translate this literature into Coptic in the first place, and presumably for a bilingual audience. We must also not neglect the question of where the translation activity was undertaken. Here is something that is nearly impossible for me to imagine. For example, that Alexandria did not play a role as the setting for much Greek to Coptic translation activity, at least in the earliest period. In fact, Funk's linguistic analysis and his interpretation of its results provide strong evidence that at least some of the Nag Hammadi codices or tractates were initially translated in Bohairic territory in the north, hence very likely in Alexandria, before they traveled south and were gradually adapted to their new Sahidic environment. Be that as it may, we cannot exclude the possibility that some translations were made in Egyptian metropolises up and down the Nile, such as Hermopolis, Lycopolis, Panopolis, Diospolis Parva, or Diospolis Magna, the region we're meeting in. Even in the Dakhla Oasis, where it's clear there was translation activity on the part of Manichaeans in the 4th century. Now, despite its size and international political and commercial connections, Alexandria did not hold an exclusive monopoly on intellectual and religious culture in Egypt. Coming to the end, in terms of the shape of this Coptic Gnostic literature, as we have it in our now 19 main manuscript witnesses, I'm inclined more or less to agree, as I've already indicated, with Michael Williams' characterization of it as shards and debris from religious movements of earlier generations, written materials that were being reused, assembled in new combinations and designs, scavenged for precious, enduring truths, to quote from Williams. An important question here is whether or not this characterization would have applied to these materials already at the time when they were translated into Coptic, Or were they still then, at least primarily, the property of religious movements that had not yet failed and thus shattered into shards and debris, at least not yet completely? Probably we will never be certain about the matter, but I would like to suggest that we add to William's 4 descriptive statements about the producers of at least most of the Nag Hammadi codices a 5th statement, which would apply to all the Coptic Gnostic literature equally, whether Valentinian or Sethian or Hermetic, whatever. If we also consider these, a 5th statement, namely, that they seem to have been persons who wanted these books in Coptic rather than in Greek. If we also consider these 5 descriptive statements as applying not just to the producers of the accidentally surviving manuscripts, but also to the transmitters of the texts contained in them, and to the translators of the Greek texts that lie at the beginning of the translation phase of transmission, then I would say that probably the Greek text should already be characterized as having been treated as shards and debris. For I think it is more likely that our anonymous translators were all more or less of a piece, corresponding to William's 4 descriptive statements quoted above, as opposed to each of them having been either a Valentinian or a Sethian or a Hermetist and so on. And I think it is likely that their common desire to have this literature in Coptic was an essential part of their motivation. By now it should be apparent that for me the problem of the presumed owners of the Nag Hammadi texts, or the provenance of the Nag Hammadi codices, is not so important as the problem of how the lines of transmission that eventually resulted in the Nag Hammadi codices got started, and what the nature of that transmission was. For even if it could be proved that the Nag Hammadi codices were enclosed in a ceramic jar and buried by Egyptian monks as their own possession, or that the scribes or bookbinders of the Nag Hammadi codices were Egyptian monks, this would be a very interesting fact in the history of early Christian monasticism. But it would by no means prove that early Christian monks were the typical owners of such literature, nor the typical transmitters or translators of it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to Professor Stephen Emmel for his great lecture, from which we gained a lot. We wish him more success in his researches in this subject. May God help him. Please let us delay the discussion to the end of all lectures. It will be half an hour. Now we translate to another lecture. Professor James Turing is from Mary University